The land where Thornhill stood is empty now. Forest, grass, the ghost of a foundation beneath the soil. No marker stands there. No tour guide leads visitors across the fields. The past has been allowed to sleep, but stories, even those buried deep, have a way of breathing through the earth. The truth of Thornhill is not simply about one woman's monstrous ambition. It is about the quiet endurance of the people she sought to control, the ones who finally refused to live or die by her design. It is about the secrets they chose to keep, not for shame, but for ownership, for dignity, for the right to decide how their story would survive. If this story stayed with you, if it unsettled you or made you wonder about the histories that lie beneath your own hometown, share it. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from and what forgotten places haunt the land around you. The past is never as distant as we want it to be. By morning, Katherine Thornhill was officially missing. Old Kendrick, the overseer, walked the length of the property calling her name, peering into thickets, searching the creek beds. He found nothing. The sheriff from Wesboro, summoned out of duty rather than hope, wrote a brief report suggesting that Katherine had fled ahead of the advancing Union forces. Papers were filed, notices posted. No further investigation followed. In the quarters, silence was the law. No one spoke of the night before. No one ever would, not even decades later. They had learned to protect one another in ways history could never fully penetrate. The war marched on without them. Sherman's troops cut their path through Georgia, though they passed north of Burke County. By April of 1865, the Confederacy collapsed, and freedom, fraught and uneven, arrived by decree and bayonet and the simple impossibility of continuing a system already broken. Thornhill Estate entered a kind of limbo. Jonathan, technically Katherine's heir, had no legal standing. He had been registered as enslaved in the county records. Lawyer Talbert, faced with a situation that defied the logic of property law, eventually abandoned the estate to whatever fate time assigned it. Most of the people who had been bound to Thornhill by force left within weeks. They sought husbands or wives sold long ago, mothers who had vanished into Alabama, children taken to Mississippi plantations that chewed through lives like grain. They followed rumors, followed hope, or simply walked until they found a place where no one knew the name Thornhill. Some remained temporarily. Hope stayed, helping those who had nowhere to go. Thomas stayed too. Thomas, who had been used as rootstock, who had been silently bound to a daughter he could not acknowledge. At last he spoke with Elena, a single conversation marked by a grief so deep they never touched the subject again. Elena lived on the estate until 1867, learning how to survive outside the rigid cage of her mother's creation. She moved to Savannah, married quietly, never had children, and never spoke of Thornhill again. She died in 1903. Her obituary a neat column that made no mention of Burke County. Jonathan stayed a little longer, trying to plant, trying to coax something alive out of soil that had been worked to exhaustion. But cotton prices were low, and the ground held too many ghosts. In 1869, he left Georgia entirely, moving west under a different name. When he died in 1891, a small notebook lay among his possessions. Inside, written over and over in cramped letters, was a phrase like a prayer or a wound. I did not choose this. I did not choose this. I did not choose this. Thornhill Estate decayed after he left. In 1871, a suspicious fire blackened the main house. Weather and neglect took the rest. The county seized the land for unpaid taxes and sold it to a timber company. Trees fell. The earth shifted. The story should have ended there, buried with the house, absorbed into the soil. But in that same year, a well driller working nearby broke through into an old cistern. Inside, 30 feet down, lay a woman's skeleton. The coroner noted that she had likely been in her 30s or 40s. Scraps of cloth suggested the style of the early 1860s. Blunt force trauma marked the skull. A corroded locket found near the bones held two portraits, a man and a young boy. The record listed her only as unknown female. But people in Burke County's black community knew who she was. They had known for decades. They had kept that knowledge safe. Over the years, fragments surfaced. Deathbed confessions, coded lines in family memoirs, a letter from a Union captain detailing a disturbing system of forced reproduction uncovered at Thornhill in 1865. A graduate student rediscovered that letter in 1954 while digging through courthouse archives. She interviewed those old enough to remember the whispers. Most said nothing. One elderly woman, the great-granddaughter of someone who had survived Thornhill, gave the only answer she could. Some things happened that needed to happen. Some people did what needed doing. That's all there is. The last mystery is the one that still lingers. The 23 children Union troops found in the basement in 1864. They were freed, placed with families, scattered into the world. Records blur, names fade. But some of them lived, long enough to have children of their own, grandchildren, bloodlines that continued in quiet, unknowing branches. Somewhere in Georgia or beyond, there are people who carry Katherine Thornhill's features without ever learning the story. A glint of pale green in the eye, a copper-red thread in the hair, a shape of cheekbone that echoes someone who once believed she could bend human lives to her will. By March 1864, the weather, the rumors, and the shifting balance of power had conspired into one sharp thing: opportunity. A unit of Confederate cavalry came through, spoke bluntly of losses, of supplies, of a war that might not be won. The soldiers camped on the edge of Thornhill's fields and carried with them the grim prognosis of a collapsing Confederate effort. The tongues of the enslaved picked up every word. Hope rose through the quarters like breath. Freedom, once a rumor, began to feel like a near certainty. Katherine saw that hope and, in seeing it, felt her plans crumbling. She gathered her children that night and led them, 11 of them, from 16 years old to 6 months, into the lined darkness of her heritage room. She lit the oil lamps and showed them the jars, the journals, the family trees. She told them what she intended to protect. What she said and what followed were the last fatal miscalculations she would make. They are the hinge on which Thornhill's story turns. Katherine stood before her children with a strange, brittle calm, the lamplight flickering across the shelves of vials and diagrams behind her. She spoke of legacy, of danger, of what would come when the war reached Burke County. She spoke of protecting the family, as if the word had ever meant anything beyond her own need for control. From a locked cabinet, she withdrew a small wooden box. Inside were several glass bottles, each filled with a clear liquid that caught the lamplight like cold fire. Laudanum, she told them softly. Merciful in small amounts, peaceful in larger ones. If Union soldiers come, if they try to scatter you, to tear you from the home we built, I will not let them. Abigail's breath caught. Margaret backed toward the wall. Even the younger children seemed to understand something was wrong in their mother's voice. It was Jonathan who stepped forward first. taller now, his face taut with a dawning recognition of betrayal. "No," he said quietly. Katherine stiffened. "Jonathan, you know why this is necessary. You, of all of them, should understand." "I understood what you taught me," he answered. "Not the truth. Eleanor showed me everything. The journals, the plans, what you did to us, to them." For a moment, Katherine looked almost wounded, but the expression hardened into something sharp and cold. "I am your mother. You're our owner," Elena said. Her voice trembled, but she did not look away. Katherine lunged with the fury of someone watching her life's work unravel. The slap she dealt Jonathan echoed against the stone walls. But this time, he did not bow his head. He stood his ground, and behind him his brothers and sisters shifted, forming a wavering, instinctive line against her. Katherine saw it, the loss of control, the ruin of her careful architecture. She swept the journals and vials into her arms, clutching them as if they were her true children. "These records will outlive all of you," she hissed. "They'll prove what I built." Then she fled. Jonathan and Elena ran after her. She moved like someone driven by fever, out through the front door, across the yard toward the quarters. Lamps flared to life in the windows as people stirred at the sound of shouting. Katherine stumbled into the open dirt between the cabins, clutching the evidence of what she had done. What happened in those next minutes never existed in a single version. Every witness remembered it differently. Some saw Katherine fall, some saw someone push her, others saw only movement, a surge of bodies, a storm of long-suppressed anguish closing around her. The journals spilled into the mud, bottles shattered, pages tore. A lantern overturned somewhere, and smoke lifted into the night. By the time Jonathan and Elena reached the quarters, their mother had vanished. The yard was chaos. Voices raised, some in fear, some in fury. Silhouettes running through lamplight. The faint smell of burning paper. The people of Thornhill Estate stood together, not as victims, but as a force long restrained. Hope, the older woman who had spoken with Elena in the woods, met their eyes. Her voice was steady, neither triumphant nor apologetic. "She's gone," she said, "and that's all you need to know." Jonathan's face twisted with shock. "What did you do?" "What needed doing?" Hope answered. "Now you've got a choice. You going to raise hell for a woman who used every one of us? Or you going to let justice be justice?" Elena touched Jonathan's arm. Her voice was barely more than breath. "Let it rest." He nodded, though his eyes had gone distant. He was 16 years old and had lived his entire life inside his mother's story. Now that story was ash. Her control required social engineering. She separated children by role. The special children lived in or near the house, kept apart from the quarters. Other enslaved children were pushed into the fields earlier, their births controlled, their futures manipulated to serve the mistress's equations. Privileges were doled out to compliant families. Threats of sale loomed for the rest. The pressure was constant. A woman named Violet begged Katherine to spare her daughter Sarah from a pairing with a man old enough to be her father. Katherine answered with a choice: compliance or the sale of Violet's other daughters to settle the matter. Sarah was forced into marriage, if it could be called that, at 14, gave birth at 15, and bled to death. Violet walked into the Savannah River 2 years later, and no account recorded a funeral for either girl that spoke their names. The world shifted in the 1860s. National tensions that had felt distant crept closer to Burke County. Politics, secession, talk of war, moved into courthouse conversations, and young men left for conflict. The overseer Kane enlisted and was killed, and his replacement, Silas Kendrick, was older and less brutal, but also less effective. The plantation's isolation, which had been Katherine's shield, began to thin as news passed through the networks of enslaved people who linked one farmstead to another. Rumors of Union victories swelled like distant weather. Katherine tightened control. She accelerated pairings. She insisted on public displays of loyalty. She tried to turn anxiety into obedience. In December 1862, Jonathan turned 15. Katherine decided he was ready for the next phase. She chose Rachel, a field hand's daughter of 16, for a mock marriage in the main house, the sort of ceremony that held no legal weight and nothing like consent. To Jonathan, raised as Katherine's child and told he was an orphan rescued, it seemed a path laid by Providence. To Rachel and others, it was an instrument of bondage. The pairing produced children as planned, and the quarters watched, weighed, and waited. But in 1863, a quiet miscalculation began to unravel Katherine's control. Elelena, the mistress's second-born daughter, was curious and literate, skills that became instruments of revelation. While helping in the study, she found a journal that had been left unlocked, and with the patience of someone who had been taught to parse symbols, she decoded Katherine's cipher. What she read destroyed the story she had lived under. The ledger entries, the rootstock notes, the explicit plans for pairings that named men and dates. Her own conception was recorded as if it were a crop. Elelena confronted Katherine. The mistress's face went still. She did not deny the records. Instead, she explained, coldly and with the same rationality she applied to ledgers. This was necessity. This was stewardship. This was the only way to preserve the estate and keep the family together. She threatened exile and sale as leverage. "Do you understand what happens if you refuse?" she asked. For a girl who had been raised in the main house, refusal meant the unknown. Sale, separation, brutal labor in other hands. Elelena left the room with the knowledge in her breast and the certainty that it was not only her life that had been planned without consent. She told Jonathan. He, conditioned and isolated, could not at first see the treachery. To him, Katherine's plan might be a kind of protection. Abigail and Margaret, however, understood in ways that hardened them. Knowledge spread, not as an immediate rebellion, but as a seed. The quarters felt the change. People who had long simmered with indignation began to speak of something other than endurance. They spoke of timing, of opportunity, of the moment when chance and courage might intersect. That moment tightened in the spring of 1863 and into 1864. Confederate defeats, news of Sherman's movements, and the steady attrition of men to war left Thornhill with fewer white overseers and a mistress growing more fearful each day. The enslaved people moved more quietly, but they moved with purpose. One night, a pregnant 17-year-old named Grace tried to run. She made a brief attempt toward the east and the river, and the dogs and men brought her back. Her punishment for trying to leave, 20 lashes in the yard before everyone, was meant to terrify and to teach. Instead, it clarified a truth. Katherine's power was defensive. She wielded violence because she feared what it could not control. Whispers hardened into talk. Elelena spent more time near the quarters, learning the stories and faces Katherine had tried to erase. In the woods, under a canopy that sheltered more than trees, older women spoke of what needed to break and how it might break. The idea of acting, of not merely waiting for the war to decide their fate, took root. It was dangerous and intoxicating and, for the first time, within the realm of possibility. Between 1848 and 1856, Thornhill changed in ways that looked miraculous to an outsider and obscene to anyone who knew how the work had been done. Cotton yields rose, debts shrank. Katherine's reputation, carefully tended, transformed from desperate widow to an efficient, if reclusive, mistress. She had given the estate what every owner coveted, labor that reproduced itself at no market cost. But the ledger of her success was written in private suffering. Katherine bore 4 more children in quick succession, daughters and sons whose features echoed her own. The same high cheekbones, the same pale green eyes, the same auburn hair threaded with gold. Miriam Grayson, the midwife who had first confirmed the widow's condition, became more than a hired hand. She became an accomplice. The midwife received cash beyond her usual rates and a cottage at the estate's edge where she could live rent-free. She learned Katherine's cipher. She kept the books of births sealed. And when pregnancies occurred outside the mistress's careful plan, Miriam provided remedies. Plant-based abortifacients administered in a room behind the overseer's cottage, performed quietly so that bleeding and grief could be explained away as natural loss. The quarters murmured with stories. Women who had been pregnant 1 week lay bleeding the next, and were told, in the low voices of those who must survive, that it just happened. There was no language yet in common use for eugenics or systematic breeding. Those words would come later. But people recognized patterns. They knew what it meant that certain men were called to the house in the night, that some babies were spared and raised in the main house while others were quietly sold or disappeared, that Miriam kept a steady hand and an even steadier silence. Sometimes resistance had an answer in blood and running feet. In spring of 1851, Ruth, 5 months pregnant with a man she loved rather than one chosen for her, fled into the pine woods. She made nearly 4 miles before dogs and men dragged her back. She was held down while Miriam administered the abortifacient. Ruth survived physically, but in the slow erasure of her voice and the blanking of her smile, it was clear a part of her had been taken. She died 2 years later in a fever that passed through the quarters. The old men said she had never really returned from the woods. By 1856, Katherine's program had produced a cluster of children who occupied a strange, liminal place in the plantation's hierarchy. Officially, they were property, registered in county records as children born to enslaved women, which gave Katherine the legal claim she wanted. Yet in practice, they lived in and around the main house. They wore better clothing, ate at the family table when Katherine allowed it, and received the kinds of informal instruction the law would frown upon if noticed. Jonathan, the eldest of the special children, was 8 in 1856. Elelena, Abigail, Margaret, Samuel, William, Henry, Caroline followed in age and favored status. They were taught to read and write by Katherine herself, an illegal kindness rendered into another kind of cruelty, because literacy would only serve the mistress's careful plans. The men whose bodies had been used were either sold when they were no longer useful, or kept and broken into compliance. Isaac, the first rootstock, was sold in 1849. The purse from his sale paid down debts. Thomas, another chosen man, was forced into complicity by humiliation and violence. When he tried to refuse in 1855, the overseer, Virgil Kane, had him whipped until the public scars matched whatever shame Katherine demanded. He was brought to the house nonetheless and forced to submit. Men became fathers who could not father in any recognized way. They were made to seed children they could neither claim nor shelter. Catherine's calculations became physical archives. She converted a windowless section of the east wing into what she called the heritage room. To servants, it was a storage chamber for family records. Inside it was a shrine to her program. Shelves of leather-bound journals written in cipher, rows of small glass vials labeled with names and dates and clumps of hair, inked family trees with lines connecting names not by sentiment, but by planned pairing. Notes about constitution, teeth, temperament. It looked like the charts of a stud farm, except the animals were human. Katherine spent hours there, mapping decades into the future, imagining an estate whose labor would renew itself, a self-sustaining dynasty sown out of human lives. Her first selection was Isaac, a 24-year-old field hand born on the property, known for strength and steadiness. She summoned him to the main house one March evening, after the others had retired to the quarters. In her journal, she recorded it tersely. First planting completed with rootstock 1, weather clear and mild. She saw him again and again. By April, she wrote, initial cultivation successful. Anticipate harvest in December. The language was clinical, emotion sterilized by purpose. Richard first suspected something was wrong in late May. Katherine stopped writing in the mornings, took her meals alone, and dismissed the woman who attended her. In early June, Richard overheard a conversation that confirmed his worst suspicions. Hidden behind a bookcase in the library, he listened as Katherine met Miriam Grayson, the local midwife. Miriam's voice was efficient, professional. "Absolutely. You're certain of your condition?" she asked. "Quite certain," Katherine replied. "Sometime in early December, I should think." Richard's memory of his father's last months made the arithmetic impossible. Jonathan had been feverish and bedridden in January, incapable of intimacy. The child Katherine claimed would be conceived after Jonathan's death, conceived with someone else. Horrified, Richard realized the plan was not merely scandalous. It was deliberate deception on a scale that would shatter reputations and place the estate at risk. Richard thought of options: confrontation, legal complaint, a letter to his grandfather Danforth. But Katherine controlled the house and its papers. She read outgoing mail. Confrontation without proof would be dismissed as the tantrums of an irate stepson. So Richard watched, an uneasy spy. He noted that Isaac was summoned at night, always in the dark when the overseer was away. He saw Katherine speak to Isaac in sentences instead of commands. By July, he was certain Isaac was the father. Certainty curdled into a new horror when, searching Katherine's locked desk in August, he discovered a leather-bound journal written in cipher. He spent days decoding it in secret. What he found made his blood run cold. The journal was a manual of human breeding. It listed selected men, expected yields, 5-year projections, traits, strength, intelligence, temperament, noted as if choosing studs for stock. It detailed pairings and anticipated births like entries on a commercial ledger. Richard copied pages, trembling, his hands committing proof to paper. This was evidence. He could take it to the sheriff. He could appeal to Talbert. But Katherine found out. At dinner, she accused him of invading her study. Her voice was calm, her threat quiet and precise. "Betray my privacy, and I will take serious action." "Family loyalty is everything," she told him, carving meat with exacting strokes. The menace was clear. Speak, and she would make him appear a disturbed, resentful stepson. Richard burned the copied pages that night. He began to feel unwell. At first it was fatigue, headaches, a loss of appetite. By October, his muscles ached and his thoughts blurred. Katherine fussed over him with soups and tonics. She summoned Miriam Grayson, who diagnosed nervous exhaustion and possible consumption. She prescribed rest and a tonic from Augusta. But Richard had read about arsenic during long hours in the library. The symptoms matched. He understood, with a horror that steadied into fear. Katherine was poisoning him, masking murder as disease to silence the one person who knew enough to ruin her plan. He tried one last act of defiance in late November, a letter to his grandfather telling the story of the journal and the poisoning. He gave it to a young house servant, Pearl, pleading with her to mail it in Westboro. Pearl, terrified, showed it to Katherine instead. The mistress burned the letter before Richard's eyes and smiled with the practiced sorrow of the widow. "The fever is affecting your mind," she said softly. "It's a mercy you won't suffer much longer." Richard Thornhill died on December 3, 1847, 3 weeks before his 17th birthday. The county physician recorded consumption as the cause, wasted away with tragic speed. Katherine wore black for a year. 4 days after the funeral, she gave birth to a healthy son, Jonathan, proclaiming the child slightly premature. Few in Burke County counted back the months, and fewer still spoke if they had doubts. What could be spoken aloud in a place built on ownership and silence? What could be answered when the ledger looked like providence and the mistress looked like charity? The plantation moved on. So did Katherine, with her journals and her plans, and Thornhill Estate began, outwardly, to flourish once more. 23 children were found locked in a basement on a Georgia plantation in 1864. They looked almost like a single family portrait. High cheekbones, pale green eyes, auburn hair threaded with gold, huddled in the cold beneath iron doors. Union soldiers forced Thornhill Estate's cellars open and in the dark discovered them. Some no older than 4, some on the verge of adolescence. The eldest, a girl of 13, told the officers something that made hardened men recoil. "Mistress says we are her legacy. We cannot leave because we are her blood." The phrase landed like a sentence. Military records from the 34th Massachusetts Infantry mention the discovery only once, an evasive line in a confidential letter that sat forgotten in regimental archives for over a century. Burke County's local histories, as if embarrassed or frightened, erase Thornhill Estate almost entirely, pretending the place and its mistress never existed. But they did exist. And what Katherine Thornhill built in the years between her husband's death and the arrival of federal troops is one of the coldest, most deliberate horrors in the American story. A program of forced reproduction designed to make people genetically tethered to a property, unable to be sold away because they were, by blood, the plantation owner's descendants. The story begins on a February morning in 1847, when a young widow inherited a dying plantation and conceived a plan that would haunt Georgia for generations. That winter was the coldest Burke County had seen in 20 years. Thornhill Estate stretched across 1,700 acres of tired red clay, 7 miles southwest of Westboro, the county seat. This land had once produced wealth. By the 1840s, it was exhausted. Cotton prices sagged, debts rose, and the Mexican War had pulled labor and attention away from home. The plantation that had once done well under Jonathan Thornhill had been hollowed by gambling and poor management. When Jonathan died that February, the estate was mortgaged to the hilt. 31 people remained enslaved on the property: 11 men, 13 women, 7 children. 16 had been sold to satisfy creditors. Fear hung over the quarters like river mist. Katherine, she is named in the surviving records as Katherine Danforth Thornhill, was 28 when she became a widow. Married at 19 to Jonathan by arrangements made by her father, Theodore Danforth, she had been raised with the expectations of a genteel Southern household. Tutors, French lessons, a life of management and social standing. What she inherited instead was ruin and a son, Richard, who regarded her with a hostility that bordered on hatred. Richard was Jonathan's son by a previous wife. He was a sullen, bookish boy who retreated into the estate's small library and refused the rough practicalities of plantation life. Where Richard saw people, Katherine saw problems and opportunities. Within a month of her husband's death, Katherine met in cold, efficient consultation with the estate's lawyer, Ambrose Talbot. Sell the property and live under your father's roof in Augusta, admit failure, or somehow make the plantation profitable again, an unlikely prospect given the soil, the debts, and the depleted workforce. Neither option appealed. Returning to Augusta meant living as a dependent and wearing the stigma of failure. The farmland was tired, equipment old, the remaining enslaved workers too few to work cotton profitably, and Katherine had no funds to buy more. She sat up nights with notebooks and ledger pages by candlelight, and from that arithmetic came a thought that had the cold logic of desperation. If she could not buy workers, she would produce them. But Katherine's idea was not the slow, accidental multiplication of human lives that occurred across many plantations. It was a program, systematic, clinical, surgical in its planning. She would create a population biologically bound to Thornhill Estate, descended from her, who could not be sold away without also selling their own blood. The plan read like a ledger entry and nothing more. She would select sturdy men among the enslaved, father children by them, raise those children inside her household with privileges calculated to secure loyalty, and then pair those children with other enslaved people to produce further generations. In effect, binding labor to land by the most intimate of ties. Katherine kept what she called her cultivation records. They were not diaries. They were breeding logs written in a substitution cipher that replaced blunt human terms with agricultural metaphors. Children became seedlings. Chosen men were rootstock. Pregnancies were plantings. Pages filled with what looked like livestock or stud farm charts. Notes on temperament. Observations on health and heredity. This was not superstition. This was calculation.